So Matthew Solis is an associate professor of architecture at the University of British Columbia and a graduate of the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Solis has been visiting faculty at the Southern California Institute of Architecture, a visiting associate professor at the GSD, and a guest critic at institutions throughout Canada and the United States. He is the founder and director of Matthew Solis Architecture and the author of Icebergs, Zombies, and Ultra-Thin: Architecture and Capitalism in the 21st Century. So the book is actually published by Princeton Architectural Press, and it is available at your favorite online bookstore and many old-fashioned booksellers too. You can order the book, of course, on princetonarchitecturalpress.com, pappress.com. So let me continue with my introductions. I would like to introduce Peggy Deemer, who is a professor emerita of Yale University School of Architecture and principal in the firm Deemer Studio. She is the founding member of the Architectural Lobby, a group advocating for the value of architectural design and labor. She is the editor of Architecture and Capitalism, 1845 to the present, and The Architect as Worker in Material Labor, the Creative Class, and the Politics of Design, and the forthcoming Architecture and Labor.
It's out.
Awesome. Okay, great. Congratulations. Peggy's theory work explores the relationship between subjectivity, design, and labor. She received the Architectural Record 2018 Women in Architecture Activist Award and the 2021 John Haydock Award. Our third speaker today is Jack Self. He's an architect based in London. He's a director of REAL, R-E-A-L, editor-in-chief of Real Review and co-founder of Real Homes. Jack's architectural work is focused on domestic space and the pursuit of social equality through housing. He's an expert in experimental models of communitarian life. He specializes in financial design and alternative models of ownership. In the early 2010s, Jack popularized the phrase "form follows finance." So I would like to invite now Matthew to start your presentation, and welcome everyone. And you are mute.
Yeah, there I did. Thank you, Anna. That's great. I'm just going to share my screen and bring up my presentation. I want to just thank Cooper Union and Nader Tarani and Nora Akawi for making this event possible and hosting it and organizing it. And I'd like to thank everyone for being here and being interested in this subject matter. It's awesome to see you all through Zoom. And then of course to thank Princeton Architectural Press just for their support of this book. And I had an amazing editor, Sarah Steeman at PAP. And then thanks so much for moderating, Anna, and then Jack and Peggy so graciously to spend your time with us, with me and all of us here tonight. So I have a relatively brief presentation and then we'll kind of move into discussion. So capitalism in the 21st century is really dominated by a specific mode of capitalism, and that mode is finance capitalism. So my book is really an exploration of architecture operating as an asset or instrument within the logics, practices, and processes of finance capitalism. Finance and its associated practices have been around since the inception of capitalism, and different thinkers have positioned and conceptualized finance capitalism in varying ways. For instance, as sort of represented here in this kind of relatively crude graph or chart, Giovanni Arrighi, the Italian economist, envisioned the history of capitalism as having four dominant hegemons identified by their major cities, so Genoa, Amsterdam, London, New York. But interestingly, he saw the kind of rise of power in the hegemon associated always with a material accumulation, and then with its inevitable kind of decline, associated with a financialization, with a proliferation of financial activity, a rise of financial capitalism. So he envisioned this kind of periodization associated with rise and fall in power with finance capitalism. Kostas Lapavitsas, the Greek economist, poses a kind of different positioning of finance, financialization, finance capitalism. He describes two periods of financial ascendancy, or great periods of financial ascendancy. The first in the late 19th century, lasting up until around 1930, or the interwar years, and then the second great financial ascendancy that starts roughly around 1980 and continues to the present. So in this view, we are currently occupying the second great financial ascendancy. Frederick Jameson, a kind of differing positioning, like to describe capitalism as being composed of an epidemic of epidemics, a sort of cycle between three moments that repeats itself over and over in varying degrees. The first mode, accumulation of money through trade, followed by capital invested in agriculture and manufacture. And then the third kind of moment, which is the financial moment, that he tied very closely to speculation. So while individuals like Arrighi, Lapavitsas, and Jameson, and I could list others, of course, offer different positions for finance, they all agree that something very significant happened around 1980 and continues up into the present. So in Jameson's words, for example, I think everyone will agree that finance capital is one of the distinctive features of late capitalism, or in other words, of the distinctive state of things today. So what exactly is finance capitalism, or financialization, the process of moving into a period of dominant finance capitalism? Many different definitions. I am fond of Greta R. Krippner's definition, and she's an American sociologist that wrote a very influential, or published a very influential paper describing very factually how the American economy has gradually moved into a dominant mode of financial practice, as opposed to kind of industrial production or trade. So in her definition, a pattern of financialization, a pattern of accumulation in which profits accrue primarily through financial channels rather than through trade and commodity production. Financial here refers to activities relating to the provision or transfer of liquid capital in expectation of future interest, dividends, or capital gains. Now, this kind of move towards finance capitalism, or a kind of financial ascendancy, can be measured in many ways. And it's a sort of, I would say, indisputable that this has taken place. You can kind of look at the size and volumes of currency markets. You can, as Greta did, really look closely at where firms acquire their profits. Or you can look at something like, as is represented here, if you look on the lower left, the capitalization of all companies on all of the world stock exchanges. So in 1980, that was 1.7 trillion US dollars. And in constant dollars, by 2018, this reaches 68 trillion. So this kind of vast expansion. Now, all sorts of measurements we can use to describe this. And part of the kind of meta story of financialization in the post-1980s era is the kind of radical increase in the sheer amount of money and capital that exists in the world. What some observers call the giant pool of money, or the Great Wall of Money. For instance, Manuel Albers, who is an expert on the financialization of housing, refers to it as the Great Wall of Money. And so you can see here, IMF data from global assets under management. So those are assets that are in some sort of management fund, a hedge fund or a an electronically traded fund or a mutual fund. You know, from 1990, for instance, a little over $10 trillion, and by 2010, up to $80 trillion. In 2021, it's about $101 trillion. So this is important for architecture and urbanism in a number of ways, but this giant pool of money in the ethos of finance capitalism, where it wants to find places of profit, needs to go somewhere. And a lot of that money ends up landing in the built environment, it's flowing into architecture. And in fact, architecture is a preferred medium of finance and speculation. You know, Giovanni Arrighi, to return to him, describing his hegemons and then the kind of current hegemon that we're in now, then as now, a significant portion of capital tended to flow into speculation and into conspicuous consumption. And then as now, investment in real estate within capitalist cities themselves were the most important means of combining speculation with conspicuous consumption. So all this flow into the sort of space of architecture does a number of things to architecture. I would say that it mutates architecture. It transforms it into an asset, what we could call asset architecture, or financed capitalist architecture. And I would like to argue that we can understand this in a number of ways, but one useful way is the kind of 5 general broad characteristics of finance capitalist architecture. And one is the first one is that it is inherently unstable and creates spaces of crises. So, you know, if we think of all the waxing and waning, the ebbs and flows, the ups and downs of the markets, various markets, the tighter that architecture and urban space gets aligned with these vicissitudes in relation to the giant pool of money, that the amplitudes start to get larger and larger, which means that in many instances, there's a big overshoots with overbuilding, subsequent decay, and all of the social challenges around that. So there's no shortage of examples from around the world of this kind of space of crisis. Here we're looking at an aerial photograph of Askaya, which is a luxury development on the kind of edges of Las Vegas. And you know, it was a project that collapsed around the 2007-2008 financial crisis. And it has continued to exist in this formation since, and almost a kind of pharaonic scale of land alteration that sits largely vacant. Interestingly, now it's kind of populated eerily by just a handful of you know, very large homes scattered through this very effectively vast and in many ways sublimely beautiful earthwork. And why it looks so clean is that it's actually been continuously raked since 2008 to keep all of the kind of desert scrub out of it. So there's this kind of very strange aestheticization of it. Other examples, you know, in Ireland for you know, the infamous ghost estates. Here's one in just outside of Longford, Ireland. And these, of course, proliferated in the wake of the 2007-2008 financial crisis. And then so many more examples. The second broad characteristic is that finance capitalist architecture increasingly functions as speculative wealth storage. So serving that kind of need that Arrighi kind of identifies in relation to the great wall of money. And so in face of this sort of need, there are many formal morphological mutations, one of which are the iceberg homes that are constructed in parts of London, but also, I think, very interestingly, showing up in very different locations under very different parameters. So I'm, you know, speaking to you from Vancouver, and recently, you know, I've discovered versions of these being constructed or recently constructed with their own kind of dominant narrative on why they need to be that's very different than the London narrative, but nevertheless are these kind of subterranean depths filled out with the materialization of capital. And so I'm sure many of you are familiar with these, but we're tight rules and are tight rules and regulations, bylaws about what one could build above grade in certain areas of London. And this capital kind of needing a place to go, the architects discovered that were first associated with these projects that there was no effective rules and regulations that, in their words, stopped them burrowing all the way to China. So if you read the kind of interviews with some of the early architects, they literally say things like that. So you get these kind of strange things with, a pool, a 3-car garage, deep underground, a silver store, a ballroom. And moving on, a third general characteristic is that finance capitalist architecture is the means of uneven development and heightened inequality. So of course, the era of finance capitalism is marked, I think, indisputably with a growing inequality, and that is measured in things like the Gini coefficient. And for instance, most OECD countries, almost all of them, the Gini coefficient that measures inequality has increased from 1970s, 1980s onward. And that is played out in the built environment. The built environment architecture is one of the primary spaces of this inequality and unevenness. This is just one particular example I'd like to share with you that I think is especially kind of perverse. So on the left, what we're looking at is a photograph of an interior, a completed interior of a kitchen in a condominium unit of a building BRK Ingalls designed in Vancouver. It's called Vancouver House. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. The exterior form of the building, if you're not aware, is almost exactly what the shape of this kitchen counter is, kitchen island. So the island is actually a tilted over 90 degrees version of the shape of the tower. This is the bottom of the tower and this is the top of the tower. But anyway, for every unit within the building that was purchased, another unit was built in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. So there was what was called the world's first one-to-one home gifting program. And this was featured very prominently in the marketing of Vancouver House. And each ladder here represents or is one stair for one of these homes for a family in need. So I think this kind of underscores some of the very strange and disturbing kind of ethical peculiarities and perversions that take place in this unevenness of finance capitalist modalities. So number 4 is that finance capitalist architecture has a simultaneous propensity for being highly iconic and extremely standardized. In an instance like this, so this is taken in Torreviejo, Spain. This is the burned out shell of a pavilion designed by Toyo Ito. It was never actually finished. It was abandoned again in the 2007-2008 crisis, and then it's being sort of vandalized in various ways. But it is using a certain aspiration for iconicism, I would say, as, doing a number of things, but one of the things in which it does, in my opinion, is serve as a sort of attractor or a magnet that irrigates the kind of vast tracts of speculative housing that sits behind it. So the highly standardized homogeneity in juxtaposition with the iconicism of the pavilion. But of course, iconicism and standardization don't always exist in separate kind of spaces. They can be kind of combined onto each other, as we see here, I think, at 56 Leonard in Tribeca, not far from Cooper Union. And number 5 is that finance capitalist architecture increases liquidity. And this is a very, very important point that I want to spend a little bit more time on. So, for finance capitalism to operate optimally, it seeks to make architecture more liquid. So what is liquidity? Going into the kind of mainstream literature and advice around kind of finance and economics at investopedia.com, they define, or that website defines liquidity in this way. Liquidity refers to the efficiency or ease with which an asset or security can be converted into ready cash without affecting its market price. The most liquid asset of all is cash itself. So, very literally, a US dollar bill is exactly like every other $1 US bill. And because of that, highly interchangeable, fast and easy to move it around. Almost every description or tutorial about liquidity features very prominently a description of what it's not. So it's often the beginning description of it is what it's not. And this is an image taken from a video on investopedia.com. And this right here is what is used to show what is not liquid. So the very opposite of cash. So it's often something, it's a building, it's a piece of real estate. And very often it's a single family home with some greenery attached to it. The implication that there's a yard or exterior space, pitched roof, a visible entry. And so this is the sort of, the opposite of what's liquid. So really, liquidity can be understood on a spectrum then. At one end, the highly liquid cash, and at the other end, the illiquid real estate, and with it, the architectural constructs. And then, of course, many other things, everything sits on a spectrum somewhere between that. So stock equities are not as liquid as cash, but they're pretty close to that. And something like jewelry or paintings are not understood to be as illiquid as real estate, but pretty close to it. And I think here, this kind of common maxim or credo that you often hear in the culture of real estate or the conversations about real estate is important. So this notion that all real estate is local, I think that's important because it captures a widespread belief, a historical understanding of what is real estate, that it is super local. And I think that localness is a big reason for its illiquidity in the kind of logic and behaviors and practices of the kind of economics around it. And that is just, not to belabor something that maybe seems too simple. I think when you think of buildings, right, that very often of different typologies, designed by different architects, that have different materials, different colors, all of that tends to have a bunch of particularities that we might say are associated with localness. But then, of course, there's the neighborhood, the block, the demographics, the noisescape, what's the pollution like, and you go on and on and on. And this meant this kind of local contingencies and hyperspecificities meant that it's being widely understood to be a responsible and kind of wise investor in real estate, and by extension, architecture. One has to be aware and highly informed about this localness. And of course, to do that is extremely time consuming, right? And that time consuming process makes transactions, among other factors, in kind of architectural and real estate transactions very time consuming. So that's the total opposite of the ease of the kind of handing off cash, right? So architecture basically, or the logics of finance capitalism wants, I argue, real estate and with it architecture to move closer to cash, to make it more like a stock, to make it more liquid. And the kind of financial markets work most sort of optimally in their own logics when this occurs. Now, this slide along the spectrum takes place in numerous simultaneous ways. One is that financial instruments proper are increasingly tethered to the physicality of the real. And this is quite a new, this takes on new dimensions and proportions in the era of finance capitalism. So for instance, two prominent versions or examples of these financial instruments that are tethered to real estate are real estate investment trusts and mortgage-backed securities, both legalized and kind of made possible in REITs 1960 in the US and mortgage-backed securities in 1968 in the US. But even though they come into kind of being, so to speak, then they don't really take off in popularity until closer to that 1980s, 1990s financial ascendancy. Also very important are legal transformations, key of which is condominium laws, also invented in 1960s. So this is important because in places like Canada, Australia, the United States, up until the strata condominium laws, there was no direct way to own real estate that was separated from the ground. All existing modes of ownership were attached to the ground. So you could own a single family home, you could own a townhouse, you could own a duplex, you could own an entire multi-unit building and then rent it out, or the co-op could own it, and then upon mutual agreement, people could use units in the sky, but you couldn't directly own it. So it's only in the 1960s that this starts to be widespread, and then it really takes off in the post-1980s era. Global brokerages come into being around in the 1970s and take off in the 1980s. This is a very simple thing, but up until then, there wasn't a medium of kind of business that facilitated buying and selling individual units of housing at a global scale. And then, property technology really in the 2000s starts to take off, which again, enhances that liquidity by even something like Zillow, which is very significant, I think, in allowing easy cross comparability of real estate assets across different spaces. Now, simultaneous to all of this are transformations to architectural form itself. So these transformations are working in concert with condominium laws, property technology, financial instruments, and doing this kind of shared mutation in which things are working together and producing these kind of Doppler-like effects. So, there are many examples of this. I in the book have kind of look at these 5 forms of finance. The first that we've touched on a little bit already, iceberg homes, these kind of speculative wealth storage, financial icons, which we touched on a little bit, these kind of attractors that work within a spatio-financial ecology. But number 2, exurban investment mats, these sort of self-similar housing units that are homogeneous, standardized, vast in number, which is significant. The more sort of units in play makes the markets more liquid. And these kind of increasingly take on gargantuan dimensions and transform kind of incredible scopes of space on the planet. Super podiums, number 3, by locating units of investment, so for example, condominium units, in here, these kind of 2 little towers in this diagram, on top of a podium that typically includes retail or commercial, the units, I would argue, are effectively delocalized because they are disentangled from the messy unpredictability of the public. Now, of course, podiums have existed for a long time. Since there's been towers or things to put on podiums, they've always existed. But within the logics of finance capitalism, they expand, I would argue, almost into a kind of universal plane that allow these kind of relatively liquid assets to sit upon and be interchanged. And then number 4, ultra-thin pencil towers, a kind of apotheosis of simplification and the facilitation of remote ownership, which I think is a key kind of dimension here. Now, just quickly, some sort of few photographs. This case of exurban investment mat, a relatively small one, but this is in the desert in Nevada, but is part of a pattern of them incrementally showing up and then taking, coalescing together. And it's really remarkable. I mean, it's each home within there is has its own four walls and is separate from the others, but it's so narrowed down that it's almost one kind of mat structure. In this case, moving over diverse or kind of fairly energetic topography. I'm not sure what you'd call that, but in the south of Spain on the Mediterranean coast, a kind of version of an exurban investment mat in which kind of Northern European aspirations for sunny vacations and the seaside overlap with speculative possibilities. Mexico provides a sort of shocking examples of exurban investment mats. And in this instance, a deliberate kind of program to attract very low income individuals into the private housing market, and in a way that Wall Street heavily involved with. And so this is outside of, around the edge of Mexico City, San Buenaventura. And this is the photographs taken by an artist named Livia Corona. So, and then, quickly, no shortage of sort of super podiums to show as examples. This is Zorlu Center in Istanbul, this kind of undulating, we're seeing the roof plan of the super podium, and tellingly, these sort of 4 condominium towers that are just sort of white voids sort of floating above, this kind of new nature, and then seeing the city below. Icon Brickell by Architectonica in Miami, condo tower with this very big podium that has this sort of vast, immense, the size of this pool is gargantuan, but vast sort of leisurescape upon which the units of investment sit. So the era of finance capitalism is also, it's witnessed a sort of steady march towards slenderness and height in condominium towers. And of course, where I think many of you are, Cooper Union is very acquainted with this, because you can see this in Midtown Manhattan in the sharpest relief, but the phenomena is not isolated to only there. So you see here a kind of march towards 111 West 57th Street that, is a remarkable structure, 1,420 feet tall, the world's second tallest residential tower, and a sort of mind-blowing slenderness ratio of 1 to 23. And for the second tallest residential building, it only has 58 units. So this is, in a way, like I would argue, a kind of a height, literally and conceptually, of finance capitalist architecture. So within here, there's the radically simplified unit, moving far along the spectrum towards cash and stock-like liquidity. So, many of these things are simple, but I think their effects are quite profound. A unit within here, an asset within here, requires minimal security and maintenance at the scale of ownership, right? So there's a kind of, obviously, a very tightly controlled access point at the ground, a long elevator ride up into the sky to the unit. The condominium management structure, it collectivizes most maintenance activities. Which is very different than that example of the illiquid house, right? Where the roof fails, where those hedges grow, where if you're not there for 3 months and it's sitting empty, someone might notice that and break into it. There's all of these sort of concerns around security and maintenance and repair and upkeep that demand much more strongly demand physical bodily contact in that Investopedia example of illiquidity. But here, and in most condominium towers, you would be fairly at peace of mind if you didn't visit at all for 9 months, a year, and you could be reasonably assured, because of the access point, the collectivization of maintenance, and the morphological kind of disposition towards maintenance, that it would be absolutely fine, right? So the sort of condominium structure, along with the morphology, facilitates remote ownership, which I think is really important when we think of liquidity. And ultimately, you know, the unit, of course, is pulled far into the sky, which is a socially disentangled territory, which is completely different from the messy unpredictability of the ground. So it's a kind of protected post-social asset. All of the units in the building are either occupying one entire floor or 2 floor units, and the elevator deposits you directly into your unit. So gone is something so simple and basic as a shared horizontal circulation space, and with it, any possibility of a chance encounter with other human beings. Another way in which the ultra-thin is a kind of post-social architecture, totally or relatively delocalized architecture. Now, it would be a mistake to think that ultra-thinness can only be found in the towers of Midtown Manhattan. I mean, you can find it in towers elsewhere, but like Vancouver, Toronto, Melbourne. But not only that, you don't only find it in towers. It's most exemplified in towers, but its morphology and ethos can be found elsewhere. So like take, for example, One Hyde Park by Roger Sturck Harbour and Partners in London. In a way, you know, when you look at these kind of what they call promontories, right? And much of this building has like these entire edges are single units. So it's almost, you can almost imagine this as one tall, slender building that has been chopped into 4 segments and then arrayed across the ground. And when you look at the operational diagrams created by the architecture firm, it's sort of, and here, you know, so one up on the screen right now, it reveals that it's entirely about a kind of post-social isolation. So this is, you know, there's private elevators, a whole series of them, and they deposit you into spaces that are kind of shaped in such a way that you will guarantee that you're not going to see any of the adjacent kind of people. You will never see your neighbors. This kind of course, you'll have a great view. Also in combination with this, but it's very opposite a kind of socially rich entanglement. And again, I think this is an example of morphology moving architecture along that liquidity spectrum. Now, and let's also not forget that many of these spaces are effectively empty much of the time. So, and this doesn't necessarily mean that they are, you know, never used, but they might be second homes, third homes, fourth homes that are rarely inhabited. One Hyde Park is sort of a famous example of relatively sparse actual use. But this kind of phenomena can be traced around the world, and I think is in itself a prominent feature of finance, capitalist urbanism, and architecture. You know, so you could give many examples, but Barcelona is said to have 1,000 very rarely used units. Manhattan, 122,000 almost never used units. Paris, according to the studies that the government has taken, you know, up to 200,000. And to combat this, you know, different jurisdictions are in the process recently and ongoing enacting all sorts of legislative attempts to solve the challenges of this. So Paris enacted a second home tax in 2015, Melbourne a vacant residential property tax in 2017. Hangzhou in China made it illegal for single adults to buy any second home. And in fact, in 2017, there was a study conducted by Chinese academics that reported that 21% of all urban housing in China was empty. And that same year, Xi Jinping at the 19th Party Congress kind of declared houses are built to be inhabited, not for speculation, underscoring the challenges of occupancy, under occupancy. Now, this is an image of a launch for a condo project. This one happens to be in Toronto, but this is happening in rooms all around or in many places in the world. And it's being launched here to the folks who are going to help sell it, right? It's the kind of marketing folks. And interestingly, in many jurisdictions, investors can buy an assignment to eventually purchase a unit. It's basically a guarantee that you will be able to get a unit. So it's what's often called a pre-sale assignment. And you're able to buy that assignment many years before the building is complete. And this is for condos. And you know, 5 years out before it's even started construction, or while it's during construction. And this is really, really interesting. This phenomenon, because they're pre-sale assignments, they're not legally considered real estate assignments. They fall under different tax regimes and public reporting regimes. In most jurisdictions, real estate transactions are public ledger. And so you know the price and know when the transition took place. Not the case with these assignments. So they're under a kind of cloak of relative secrecy. But very remarkably, in my mind, these assignments can be bought and sold and traded. And there's a kind of market of pre-sale assignments. And it's clearly, well, almost always done for speculative purposes. And there is sort of these urban mythologies about lining up outside condo sale centers and you know, camping overnight. And you know, I have these amazing photographs of people camping overnight to get their pre-sale assignment. And then there's these mythological tales of people at the front of the line, you know, just walking, but getting their assignment and walking to the back of the line and selling it for like $50,000 profit. Of course, yeah. Well, anyway, it's so effectively, the pre-sales market is a version of an architectural futures market, I would argue, in which floor plans and renderings operate as financial assets. The physical building itself is diminished in importance. It's still in the picture, but it's demoted. So architecture here moves even closer to that kind of utopia of finance capitalism, of heightened liquidity. Now, Reinhold Martin has used the term real virtualities, which I think is quite useful. So this is a kind of condition where the sheltering corporeal function of architecture is de-emphasized to allow it to operate optimally as a preferred medium of finance. And this is my last image, and I'll end here. But this is an image rendering used as part of the marketing campaign for 432 Park Avenue by Raphael Vignoli. And I always was sort of struck by the kind of the bathtub, you know, and the sort of the way in which it kind of calls forth the imagination of bodily inhabitation, but also emphasizes its absence. And then I started noticing that many of like projects around the world in, you know, whether it's in Toronto or in China, would have these sort of empty bathtubs. And I think we can unpack that in many ways. And of course, there's a lot going on there and why that is. But I think this kind of strange sort of real virtuality is related to the kind of desire that's present here. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop there.
Wow, Matthew, thank you so much. This is incredibly exciting. So I would like to invite Peggy, right, to start her response now.
I have many things to say, and mostly I just want to start by saying how much I admire this book. And for those of you who don't have the book and are listening to this talk as your first kind of introduction to Matthew's work on financial capitalism, buy the book, because for every image he shows, there's so much other information and examples, and it's just so full. So anyway, buy the book. But before I start on kind of what I want to say, I have to talk about that last image, because one of the things that has struck me about the residential pencil towers is what I find completely insulting about high rises, or the shift about high rises, where whatever we might think about the traditional skyscraper that were, you know, temples to the economy and temples to money, they were in some way a symbol about a culture, you know, a culture of capitalism. But these are the workforces, this is the company, this is Woolworth, this is CBS, you know, all of those different things. And they shape the skyline. And now what's shaping the skyline are these very private home things, you know, and so it moves from something that speaks to a culture, maybe a culture we don't like, but speaks to, you know, where we work, to private ownership in every way, to the bathroom. And so it's not even the family gets to own this and, you know, your company gets to come and look at this. It's kind of like, it's not even the family, it's you in the most private space. The most private body gets that. I mean, it's just boggling to me. And I guess I get shocked that the promoters or even the architects aren't embarrassed by this. I just find it incredible. So anyway, it's a great image to end on. But kind of to go to, you know, what I was thinking about, for me, what I appreciate about your work, Matthew, and the book, in some way is that in my Architecture and Capitalism, this is the final chapter, you know, the contemporary chapter writ large. And so I just appreciate what it does, you know, within those efforts, which is to say the stories that we generally tell ourselves as architects about architecture, which is a kind of stylistic progression and how it is we move from kind of one form and one set of concerns to another, you know, within a history that looks at architecture itself unrelated to the rest of the world, unrelated to finance, unrelated to capital. And so for me, I really appreciate that work around what we might call the base. You know, so the architecture isn't just related to its own stylistic superstructure, it's related to a base, and we ignore that at our peril. And so I kind of appreciate you're doing that so thoroughly in such an updated way. But it also kind of makes me think about another, I don't know, set of concerns that I'm interested in and that I think you participate in, which is how within that relationship between style / superstructure and base / finance, that architects have been serving capitalism in ways that it hasn't recognized, you know, and it used to be that the concerns about architecture really kind of had to do with production. And so we cared about factories and we were interested in that. But then when capitalism kind of moved from being interested in production and manufacturing to being interested in a service economy and consumption, how architecture kind of helped that with making a sophisticated citizen, with its corporatism, again, you know, making us recognize that our style was related to, we could call it kind of American corporate sophistication, postmodernism, how kind of aesthetics itself becomes part of what we consume, and moving through deconstruction and stuff, and now to finance capitalism. And what strikes me about this, which I hadn't thought about until your book, is that in that we can see how architecture serves capital clearly, but in some way the role of the architect or the image of the architect slowly disappears. I mean, we could definitely see how in modernism, our big figures of modernism, whether we're thinking about Mies or Korb or Gropius or even Frank Lloyd Wright, those were figures that had prominence in our cultural discourse. And slowly, I think what's happened, and you're showing this, is that in fact, architects and architecture kind of begins to disappear in this. And, I think what's interesting about what you're showing is that we don't even see a singular style in what you're describing. In fact, you can call up certain big names that we know, whether it's Shop or Vignoli or whatever. But the reality is that this is something that really doesn't have a particular figure of the architect that participates in it. It's too dispersed. And I think in your book, one of the things that you, maybe it's Reiner de Graaf who said this, is like, when architecture becomes real estate, finance takes over. And that's really what it is. Like, architecture's disappeared almost in this financial condition. And so, so it's just interesting to me that as we serve capitalism more and more, we kind of disappear as an institution that matters, which I think is depressing. But if I describe this kind of teleology, it's not teleology, but, this kind of capitalism changes and we keep serving it unconsciously or consciously, it seems like right now that teleology kind of, I don't want to say comes to an end, but is coming to a moment of crisis, and such that we can't continue to think about this just plodding along, doing its next shape, form, mutation, and whether that crisis is exactly what you're saying, which is the wealth gap, or whether it's the housing crisis, or whether it's the ecological crisis, or whether it's the COVID crisis, or whether it's just that we know more and more that these systems can't go on, how it is that we can understand your conversation as something that will finally let us just stop pretending that we architects can keep doing this. I don't know. It's kind of the question that I want to ask you when we go into discussion, but I really appreciate that in some way you bring this story to a moment where we can't ignore what's going on in terms of our discipline and how it contributes to what I am thinking is a real moment in crisis. So anyway.
Thank you so much, Peggy.
Yes, thank you, Peggy. And Jack, please.
Yeah, maybe I can pick up directly from there. And actually, in terms of this crisis, I have reflections on that. But first, I also want to say, like, if you don't own the book, buy the book. I remain surprised by how few people there are who are addressing the relationship of late capitalism to architecture. Full stop. There is almost no one who has anything close to Matthew's rigor, precision, clarity. It's just like, it's a delight to read. So I really recommend it. And I guess, one of the things is to reflect on the role of the architect, which is often absent from these discussions, I think, in any kind of serious way. And I have many thoughts on that, on what the architect can do to reclaim agency, but perhaps we'll come to that later on. But what I would just make as a kind of comment, I think Peggy's absolutely right about the decline of the architect. I would argue that the cultural relevance and agency and power of the architect was the kind of canary in the coal mine, which was followed shortly by the art world, and has left really the center of cultural production today being in the world of fashion. In the 1980s and 90s, I think you could look to architects as, certainly the 1990s, you could look to architects as providing the avant-garde of cultural production in many ways. I think by the late 90s and early 2000s, this really belonged to the art world and the kind of hyper-financialization of art. And now I would argue that both of those spheres have declined in significance. They've become overly financialized, which makes them culturally irrelevant. And the only one which really has managed to combine cultural relevance with hyper-production is the world of fashion. But that's a different argument for another day. I want to come back specifically to some of the things that Matthew was talking about. The first is this point about all real estate being local, and particularly this kind of strange tension between iconicity and genericness. which of course, as Matthew also points out, is inherent in the same structures. I mean, and the way that I understand that is, of course, you have the standardization of everything down to the standardization of the design of bathrooms and kitchens, and everyone has a kitchen island, and all of these very recent typological inventions. Everyone has an ensuite now. These are super recent in architectural history, and they're standardized everywhere around the world in order to allow you to more or less swap an apartment in Beijing for an apartment in New York. So it's to create the generic quality creates that liquidity, while the uniqueness of the facade really talks about the ability to kind of speculate on its iconic silhouette or the image of the building as a way to increase its value. And in that sense, in material terms, I'm very interested by how architects address this. I'm aware that in Dubai, for example, abandoned properties or rarely occupied properties have lavatories or toilets which flush automatically at a given period of time to prevent the creation of Legionnaire's disease within the conduits in the building. So your toilet flushes automatically once a week in order to prevent this. But we're really talking about kind of hyper abstract and as Matthew pointed out, through the rise of financial instruments, kind of derivative architecture. I mean, I think that the ultimate conclusion of this would basically to have pre-assignment, or as we call it in the UK, off the plan, without ever having to construct. I mean, that would be the ideal, really, that you continue to swap options in a futures market without anyone ever having, and all architects do is make images. I mean, that's the kind of NFT of the future of architecture. And this kind of brings me maybe, I mean, the final point I wanted to make actually is really about this question of crisis. And I don't think I have time right now to go into why there is so much money in the global economy, how that ended up. That's like a colossal error. I mean, one of the biggest mistakes of the last 40 years has been the hyperproduction of money, both by states and by the private banking sector. But in essence, because you have this hyperaccumulation, hyperproduction of capital, there's so much of it that it needs to go somewhere. And in the late 90s in London, people used to talk about swag. It had to go into swag, which was silver, wine, art, and gold. And now not even swag is enough. It really has to go into property because there aren't assets which cost enough. I mean, even at the limit, you can only really get a painting for, you know, $30 or $50 million. And that's not enough. People need to lock up even more. And what I'm really interested in terms of crisis, I don't believe that a housing crisis will cause the end of capitalism. I don't believe that a pandemic can cause the end of capitalism, because in essence, capitalist property markets function through structural shortages. So they have always designed a shortage of supply into the ability to increase the value of the properties. The only experiment that I'm familiar with which attempted to create enough housing to match population was Soviet Russia under Khrushchev. And of course, that in many ways was not a success, but is an admirable effort nonetheless. And Western countries will never attempt to do that. And the promotion of mass home ownership means that politicians can never do anything to increase supply, because it will decrease the value of the homes of the majority of the voting public. So you're in a bit of there's no political solution, there's no economic solution. And I don't think that any social crisis can produce that. But global warming, now that's climate crisis is a beautiful mistake for contemporary capitalism. It's the natural consequence of an economic model that says we're going to have infinite profit infinitely forever on a finite globe. And of course, at a certain moment, you hit an environmental barrier, which goes beyond any of the conceptual and economic and political issues which have confronted capitalism before. And so there's a kind of interesting calculation to that, which is basically, if you want to have a marketplace which is talking about the use of architecture as a way to store your capital, then actually the quality of that architecture becomes really important. So its resource consumption through time becomes important. but also where it is becomes important. So I don't think anyone who has got more than a 5 or 10 year forecast would be considering buying property in Miami Beach, because climate crisis will almost definitely render that city uninhabitable in the kind of next 40 or 50 years. But the basic calculation for me in that climate crisis question and its relationship to speculation is that you have, on the one hand, a global population decline by the end of the century, and on the other hand, you have a global property destruction as a result of rising sea levels and extreme weather. So the basic calculation for me is, will more people die than property is destroyed, or will they balance each other out and be able to stabilize property markets? And it's a morbid calculation, but it's one that I just thought of while listening to you, Matthew, and that's my reflection on maybe some of the things that you've spoken about. But yeah, anyway, I'll stop there. Otherwise, I could go on forever. But yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much, Jack. I appreciate it. That's great.
Yes, thank you very much. I don't know, Matthew, do you have any comments right now to Peggy or?
Well, I mean, yeah, like just in the spirit of like a discussion. I mean, it's both. Thank you so much for your comments. I think they both raise very interesting kind of lines of thinking and issues. I mean, I'm super intrigued. I mean, this kind of Peggy that you talked about, this sort of the crisis and the diminishing kind of position of the architect, and the architect disappears completely. I mean, I think that I think is related to how all the different crises we can describe that are commonly described around housing. It seems to me that there is a set kind of discursive toolkit of presumptions that are kind of longstanding about what the solutions might be. So, let's say around affordability, right? So, so many cities around the world, affordability challenges. Well, it's like, okay, there's a certain discursive thing about we need to increase supply. It's a supply problem. If we, if we lower the barriers to construction and urbanization, the permitting process, in Vancouver, they're trying to figure out how to make the permits go way quicker, right? And therefore, if we build more things faster, we'll solve the problem. Or if we figure out if architects are really intelligent about, use of materials, and the contractors are really smart about building things in a shorter compressed time, it will lower. So, right, so there's a kind of procurement, material technology discourse, and then even a kind of efficiency of design discourse. These are such long-standing conversations that have just sort of been tried, or the modalities have been tried over and over and over again. So I think this kind of, the disappearing architect is also related to the disappearing kind of discursive potential and imagination on around how to solve these challenges that orbit around these issues. So I think I'm really excited about like how it demands of us significant speculation of almost in a way of not looking at the problem directly, because the problem is so that there's these kind of discursive roots that are so well channeled that I think we really have to come at it from other ways. And I wonder if they're like really surprising ways, and I don't know, right? I just sense that there are these big surprising ways that need to be tested. And maybe within that, the kind of, I mean, who's to say that architects, will ever have a special and unique role in all of this? But maybe in that radical approach from the side and from behind and from the top and directions we don't even know, the architect is able to find herself or himself again in a kind of a fresh way. What do you think, Peggy?
I totally agree with that. I particularly agree with the fact that we need to not look at it so directly, that it will come in some other perspective that is on the sidelines now, but will be foregrounded. But in the midst of this, I just think the refusal to work, it's just like architects should not do those things. It's that's very direct. But I think that very directness might be helpful in getting us to another sphere of understanding where our input, where our intelligence, where our relationships with construction, with communities, with material, procurement, all that stuff comes into play.
Yeah. I mean, I have a very concrete, not to make Matthew's book launch about me, but I have a very concrete proposition or example for what it is that you're describing, which is, and the architect is extremely important in the future of a capitalist or post-capitalist or whatever that might be, forms of property relations, precisely because the architect is one of the few entities who's able to integrate the variety of professions and specialized thinking which is needed in order to think around these issues. So basically, very short line, what it is that I've spent the last 10 years, but particularly the last 2 years doing is saying, well, the only way to create affordability is actually to change the financial metrics through time, and therefore to create buildings which have incredible durability and whose fundamental business model is not based on build to sell, but on build to rent, let's say. But build to rent where the capital cost is spread over something like 100 years. And where you're pursuing environmental standards which allow you, in the case of the building model we're developing, to reduce your operating costs by between 60 and 80%. So you have a building then which is has incredible longevity, has very low operating costs, and that allows you, by funding the building over a much longer period of time, to reduce the annual payments and thereby reduce the rent. So that's a way of using time as a metric to avoid the classic problem of density as the solution to supply. The second thing I would say in relation to that, though, is that fundamentally what it is that my company and I have been working on is the creation of a new asset class. And basically what that means is that the architect has to begin by integrating, in my case, ethical and social needs with existing financial logic. And that's, I would say, mainly not a technical question. It's really a cultural question as to how. And the big thing that I would point to within that is the rise of what's called ESG, or sometimes called socially responsible investing, or ethical finance, or whatever. It's green money. I mean, it's kind of a bullshit term in many ways, but nonetheless, it's interesting to see it rising as a sector. It's now 30 trillion, growing by 60% per year, because millennials don't want to put their parents' money into slave labor in Xinjiang or Saudi petroleum. But only 5% of that capital is going into real estate, because developers have absolutely zero interest in making properties which qualify for environmental, social, and governance impact. So I think there are already changes, and I see the rise of ESG as capitalism's attempt to survive beyond the climate crisis. And so it'll be interesting to see the extent to which architecture begins to become sucked into that process through the creation of new financial models, new asset classes, in exactly the same way that so many of the let's say, typologies that Matthew was pointing to have emerged also out of very specific liberalizations or deregulations of particular markets and new financial products.
So thanks so much. I mean, Jack, I mean, I've admired the way in which you approach this topic for a long time, and I think you're a real example of someone who kind of delves into the logic of finance and treats it as something integral to the potential, finding new potentialities for the architect. I'm kind of curious what both of you think. Like, one question, like, I mean, this is so, you know, for Jack, for you to do what you do, you need to become cognizant and sort of versatile in the logics of financing. I'm always sort of struck, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, of the role of the marketer in all of this, right? And you know, marketers in most contexts of the production of buildings. They are paid more by the clients. And if we think that within the capitalist system of building production, that how much you're paid is somewhat in relation to how important you're conceived by those who have the doling out the money, I wonder, it seems a lot of this is a social challenge, and it is a kind of, in a way, a kind of ideological challenge that maybe marketing and kind of the kind of history and ideas of propaganda as connected to ideology kind of play a role. And I wonder if the architect needs to become friends with kind of enlightened, let's call it that, critical financiers. I mean, what's the relationship to the marketer or the propagandist, or is there something where the architect can increasingly occupy that space? Like, I don't know, Peggy, what are your...
I'll just say very quickly, and I don't think this is the answer you want. I mean,
no, I don't know. Yeah.
The answer that Jack is saying, but I think if we wanted to do better marketing, we should show society that we care about the environment, and the long-term sustainability of our built environment. As long as we are known for doing what shop is doing, we have no reason to be trusted by anybody who is going to really want to change policy and change the nature of how things are financed. So I think our marketing would begin with showing that we are not just hired decorators for finance capital. And we have to say that loudly and clearly for another conversation, for another audience, for the public to trust us to actually say something valuable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's why I just think, the refusal to do that kind of work would be the first step of saying, we're not part of this. We're not part of it. We're interested in something else.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you completely, Peggy. I think as a side point, I would say that one of the reasons why I've been so interested in the world of fashion and art direction and creative direction in the last couple of years has mainly been because I'm interested in understanding how particularly the world of fashion uses the idea of desire as a way to generate interest, but actually how desire can be used, or let's say seduction can be used as a form of ideological communication. So how do you change norms, not through protest, not only through protest, not only through resistance, but also through seduction, and how might that operate? But I do also think, and what I'm about to say is extremely, I'm going to sound extremely irritating in what it is I'm about to say, but I agree with Peggy completely. I mean, I'm lucky that I grew up poor, which means that I'm not afraid of having nothing. And therefore, I would prefer to be poor again than to go and work doing many of the types of projects. Basically, death holds no fear for me. And therefore, I've just refused. I've refused to work I've refused to use my abilities for evil. It's just and of course, that has a lot of consequences. I lived in shitty housing for pretty much most of my adult life until very recently. And, I couldn't afford to have kids or anything like that. I mean, it's the classic millennial conundrum. But nonetheless, I would still prefer to be doing that than I would be to, working in full knowledge, going to university and reading Karl Marx and, all of these cool guys. And then, reading Feminist Mystique, and then reading, A Grand Domestic Revolution, and then going and working for one of those guys in $1 million listings. I mean, it's not possible. It's not morally supportable, and I don't encourage others to do it. But anyway, I speak only for myself.
Oh, well, thank you so much. This is an amazing discussion. And to make it even more exciting, I would like to invite everybody to post their questions and comments on our chat. I think there's a number already coming in, so I will read those shortly. And maybe what I can do is just start with Matthew, if that's okay, asking you a question of my own that I've been actually dying to ask for some time, using, in fact, our kind of mutual experience in graduate school, which I'm sure we both at some point took the public and private development class by Gerald Caden, which was a joint course between the GSD and the Kennedy School of Government. And in my case, it was the first sort of exposure to this relationship between space and finance and this notion of architecture as real estate. So he published also a book a while ago called Privately Owned Public Space, already probably 2 decades or so old. And in that book, one of the kind of narratives was that the developers would be allowed extra stories and extra square feet in exchange for this kind of new type of public space that resulted in kind of a range of strange typologies. So there were privately operated plazas, winter gardens, etc. And the question that I have for you is somewhat open-ended. Is your main focus in the book is on the private sector, right? And the new typologies that emerged as a result of this, what you call formal morphological mutations. And you've listed some amazing ones and they're very, very exciting. How do you see this typologies changing the public domain, right? What are the larger, perhaps maybe systemic implications for the public sphere, you know, from those private ones that we're seeing happening that are so clearly defined by you?
Yeah. Thanks, Anna. That's a really interesting question. And I think there's a lot to be said on that topic. I mean, in the book, I have a quote from, it's a very well-known quote that Mayor Bloomberg, you know, was quoted as saying something, I can't remember the exact words, but he basically was like, it's amazing, we have to attract, you know, as many billionaires as we can, because those folks will pay for everything, you know, through taxes for everyone else, right? So this kind of, I would say that there is a common belief across many political urban spaces in the world, in the Western world certainly, that private capital manifests and kind of, you know, brought into being through these buildings will, through things like, you know, and they're often called community amenity contributions or DCLs, you know, development cost levies, all these kind of mechanisms from which money will be directed to the common good. So this is this is a very common modality, right? A kind of urban architectural philanthropy that's built into the governing and formation of our cities. So like this thing that Gerald Caden is talking about and you're talking about is I think it's a dominant characteristic. So your question is vital importance. And I think it's like, yes, sure. We you know, our cities are acquiring many instances of, like say in Vancouver, daycares are frequently constructed with these DCLs or CACs. We have a huge public art program that is produced through the CACs. In fact, that is the entire way in which public art is produced in the city for all intents and purposes. And I mean, the ways in which that capital affects the daycares, affects the community centers, I mean, you are innumerable, right? Because like take the public art component, for instance. These public art pieces are typically built on the site of the you know, so they're kind of at the edge of public space. So they're these privately owned public spaces. They can be viewed 24 hours a day, but they're adjacent to the property. And the way in which the artist is selected and the piece is commissioned is that there's a board, but the board is made up of a whole host of you know, public figures, like a certain artist or a certain architect, all that. But of course, there's a whole host of people from the development community because they're like, well, you know, this is our building, we have to do it. So the aesthetic regime of what is permissible within these public art projects is highly narrow. Like nothing disturbing could be done, right? So it's this anodyne emphasis on like what is a spectacle. So like that all things artistic in public space must be attractive purely in the spectacle way. They can't provoke any form of kind of philosophical questioning that might be disturbing, right? And so what a limited version of art. And then, when you look at the kind of daycare facilities, they're positioned within the podiums usually, right? Like that's very interesting too, like the kind of what gets stuffed into podiums in many jurisdictions. But the overall logic for how to create these kind of assets above, the increment of structure, the kind of access points, control points, is the determining logic. It's very different from a kind of, a bunch of, civic officials with tax money that's not directly tied to a real estate development, making decisions on what, early childhood education needs, and let's start from scratch. So I think it's profound. And what's very disturbing in this sort of current era, this neoliberal finance capitalist era, is increasingly we're reliant on these mechanisms, right? Like it's not long ago. I mean, let's not forget, right? It's not long ago that we had these kind of things constructed in totally different delivery mechanisms, but we're not as reliant on these private systems.
Can I ask a quick question in relationship to Duan is asking? You make the point when you're talking about the vacancies that one needn't put amenities in because no one's living there anyway. That was kind of this amazing quote that you had, when one of the commissioners in New York, was talking to the developers, and he's just saying, "Oh no, you don't worry about those amenities. No one's living there anyway."
Yeah.
And then you raise the question about whether that's going to force the cities or the city planners to rethink zoning, to rethink infrastructure, to really think about public services. And so in some way, dialectically, maybe these kind of privatizations that have such clear implications on the street, where you park, where you will force the city to think more publicly. Do you think that's
a
possibility?
Perhaps. You mean so in their kind of like obvious absurdity and their kind of
correct?
Yeah. No, I mean it's interesting. It's interesting. I mean, we have, that's a very interesting question, Peggy, because I think one thing that's kind of very trippy about all of this is that all of us have whether we're architect urbanists or not, I think we have a very kind of base conception about what like non-use or underuse sort of means, and it sort of represents very deeply to many of us some signifier of a failure, right? Like it's like, well, wait a minute, this was made. And I think that the kind of the ways in which finance capitalism challenge, like that's one way. So the art pieces are anodyne, but the kind of instances of crises or underuse are this disturbing thing. And so I think we're in this kind of cognitive space where many of us are kind of left kind of grappling with what we make of that. I mean, to be optimistic, maybe that will trigger some sort of thing. I mean, the cities are, enacting all these vacancy laws and stuff like that as a registration and of the outrage, actually, right? Of people being like, well, why are these things not being used? I mean, it'd be interesting to see if that plays out at the public kind of amenity level. I haven't sort of seen that yet, but you're raising a really interesting thing, be kind of out or be on the lookout for that in the kind of discourse.
If it does change infrastructure then is a public something. I mean, it's a tentative link, they're talking about transportation, but anyway.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting to think about.
Could I ask you a follow-up question also on that, Matthew, which is about, because in a way what you're describing is cities in which there's a constant threat that the elite will leave.
Yeah.
So it seems like a lot of the projects and a lot of the mechanisms that you describe in the book are geared, as you say, geared around the attraction of that elite. And just in terms of what you and Peggy were saying then about the impact on the public realm, in your work, have you come across any kind of examples of how that kind of threat to leave has an impact on the city itself or on urban space or public space? I know it's a pretty nebulous question. It had never occurred to me before, but based on what you were saying.
Right. No, it's super interesting. Well, straightforward. I mean, the kind of tenuous nature of capital that is perceived to be from elsewhere landing, right? I think I think there is a very urgent competition that is happening amongst cities of all different scales to ensure that continues to be, or that if it hasn't been there yet, that it comes, and then that it doesn't go away. And I think that kind of plays itself out in a number of different ways. But to go back to Vancouver, I mean, there's a great real paradox with Vancouver, is that Vancouver has overtly designed itself to be a livable city, right? It uses that terminology frequently, and like very proud of its ranking high on livability indices. And livability indices, there's another kind of side story to all of this stuff, which is the emergence of global indexes, right? That measure, that really wasn't a thing in the 1940s or the 1930s, 20s, right? Like kind of measurement metrics like the Economist Intelligent Unit with its, livability rankings, and then, Monocle with its this, that, and the other. And I think this speaks to the competition and the urgency on the part of jurisdictions to maintain and attract that capital. But what I want to say about Vancouver is that Vancouver really consciously constructs this sort of livability through the daycares, through things. And then what's so paradoxical about it is that livability is in many ways what is perceived to make Vancouver a good place to invest in, right? And then has this kind of, this produces this instability and almost this sort of specter of a specter of death in a way. Like there's a kind of built into the livability is it's sort of other because of its reliance on these larger things. This is a very interesting question, Jack.
That's great. So let me start maybe reading some of actually a lot of comments, a lot of positive comments. So Professor Zoliani says that he completely agrees with Jack Self and finds the discussion.
I think he calls me Jeff, which I really liked.
That works. Good. And then Bill Patchett says the Vancouver House by big architects gave over 100 million to the city in CAC contributions. Matthew, whatever you want to do with that. Okay, and then we have a long question from or comment from Sama Shojai. So I'll read that. I find it fascinating that architecture reflects the values of society at different times in history. Wouldn't changing current forces driving architecture be achieved through a shift in societal collective values? And the values that shape us ultimately come from the education we receive. It seems to be a very deeply rooted issue that goes beyond policy or lawmaking. Should anyone want to comment on that? Matthew?
Sure. Also, so this kind of question, the values that shape us ultimately come from the education we receive. Well, I mean, one thing that comes to mind in relation to that is that I had the fortunate experience of participating in a summer school program that Peggy and her partners in crime set up. And I think, yeah, I mean, of course, I mean, the architectural pedagogy. I mean, look, I think, when we were students, Anna, at the GSD, there were courses that you mentioned that and faculty that dealt with real estate issues. And this is no kind of judgment on how intelligent or great they were as thinkers on that topic or teachers, but there was a clear hierarchy amongst the faculty, at least perceived by the students. And that whole subject matter, well, first of all, that it was encapsulated in this sort of thing called real estate.
Yes.
And there was a real higher, it was sidelined, right? There was, it was seen to be anathema to anything related to design and the much funner and cooler and more exciting things, right? And I think this kind of schism between any version of thinking of these things and the sort of stylistic things that Peggy was sort of referring to in her comments or her comments at the beginning is very much part of the challenge of sort of figuring out how we as architects navigate this terrain. So like I agree with Sama that education is a key component. And I think this kind of schism, I mean, most architecture schools that I'm aware of don't have any folks that are overtly interested in these things. And if they do, it's a small number of token individuals that are in the world of real estate. And because they're in the world of real estate, they approach it in a certain way, right? So yeah, Peggy, what about your school?
Well, thank you. And just say, I also want to thank Jack, because Jack did a lot in promoting that school. And so I think the three of us here are all to be thanked for this school and what I hope is its success. But absolutely, I think we are training people to do exactly what Shop's doing. How can I say it more directly? It's like what we put in front of the students are models of success, and we're teaching them how to be successful within that traditional paradigm. And that happens, as you're saying, Matthew, largely in the studio. And so aesthetic dexterity is the thing that gets you kudos within school, and then that aesthetic, those aesthetic kudos lead you to believe that is your mission, and then you go out into the workforce and look for a place where that's what you get to do. And if it happens to come, with a pencil tower, great, because I'm showing success, and I was trained to demonstrate my success. So the models of success need to change radically. And I think what you're saying is, the divorce between pro practice and studio, and the divorce between a real estate course and studio, all of those need to infiltrate each other, and just a different sense of what smartness, that isn't necessarily just aesthetic dexterity, but what smartness can mean in terms of being a successful architect when we think of success in a different terms.
I agree with what you've both said. I want to take the question in a slightly different way, in a more literal sense, at least as I understood it, which is the idea that architecture reflects the values of society. I think that may be true indirectly, but I would mainly say that architecture reflects the values of the power group that is able to execute architecture. So I think architecture mainly represents kind of elite or extreme kind of wealth, basically. And historically, it was invented to do that. And we often talk about like architecture being in ancient Greece or ancient Egypt or whatever. I mean, it's an invention of the 1500s, the late 1400s, as a means to exercise power in Italian city-states. So that's why it exists. And that's why I always get frustrated when I hear people talking about like Papua New Guinean architecture. It's like, for God's sake, the Papua New Guineans managed to develop a form of building without having to get architects involved in it. Like, don't foist architects on them now. They leave them be. But yeah, so in that sense, in the idea that changing the current forces driving architecture might be achieved through a shift in societal and collective values, That's true only under two conditions. The first condition is that you convince the elite to give up their privilege and power, which is not impossible, but very, very difficult to do. And the other is to take that power from them by force through everything. There are many means to do that, none of which I intend to get into right now. I do believe that education plays an extremely powerful role in both those processes, because you're either talking about mass education and the shift of mass ideology, what constitutes what I think Gramsci would call cultural hegemony, or you're talking about educating the elites to be more altruistic and more dedicated to the social good, which has happened in the past, but is a very rare thing. Anyway, I hope that's that was my take on the question.
Oh, great. Okay, so there are a couple of other questions / comments, but again, I would invite anyone who might be interested in asking questions or commenting to please do so.
I have a question for Matthew based on Eric Fisser's single word comment, which was Evergrande. Yeah.
Yes.
And of course, like we've seen, I mean, one of the things that you and I've discussed before is like, I believe the statistic is like every financial crisis for the last 150 years has begun in the property sector. And so in a way, it's kind of like, I'm never surprised when economic crashes start in the property sector. But yeah, I wondered if you had any take, particularly on some of the relationships that you've been describing in the context of China, because some of us in this chat room are old enough to remember projects like Ordos Village. And certainly a lot of the processes that you've been talking about in the context of America, at least to me, are a product of the fact that private property in China and Russia mainly was so unstable that there was capital flight to the US in order to invest in the stability of private property in Western countries. And then we've started to see a huge shift around the promotion of private property in China, but with, fundamentally different economic metrics and fundamentally different roles of the state in the management of those economies. And I'd be really keen to hear what you how your research and how your work applies or doesn't apply in the context of somewhere like China, and just what your thoughts are generally on that context at the moment.
Thanks, Jack. Well, I think, someone like David Harvey, first of all, comes to mind as someone who really, to my mind, described eloquently and provocatively the role of Chinese urbanization as a global scale absorber of surplus capital in relation to the so playing a ginormous in Harvey, and I think Harvey's to be trusted on this role in relation to that giant pool of money, or Great Wall of money. But like you said, I mean, with particular contours, and in some ways, I think it can be argued that investment in built space might play an even more important role in China to its internal market logics than the contemporary United States, at least in certain layers of the market. So I don't know how aware people are, but the rules and regulations in recent decades in China make it much more challenging to own, if you're a Chinese citizen living in China, to invest in stock markets all around the world. So there's a kind of rules and which is very different than if you're a citizen of the United States. You're free to invest globally, or save for a certain kind of quote unquote rogue states. But because of this limitation on traditionally high, like this limiting of the investment landscape for high liquid assets, like assets that are already at that one end of the spectrum, the argument is that actually an inordinate amount, an extra amount of capital at the scale of the new middle class and the upper middle class has gone into apartments, you know, in Shenzhen, in Shanghai, Beijing. And so when I described that kind of rule in Hangzhou about the single people, you know, single people not being allowed to buy their second apartment, there's actually that kind of versions of that rule get played out in a number of other cities. And so there is I think a more widespread and more publicly discussed phenomena of investing in individual units of housing, very expressly because there isn't an opportunity to buy the equivalent in stocks that, say, a Canadian citizen is. So I think that's one example of how the particularities of the Chinese context have amplified certain things. I mean, it's going to be very interesting to see what plays out right now, because as far as I'm aware, that the Chinese government the U.S. government plays a very active role attempting to mitigate the crises of 2007, 2008. I think there's a perception that in China of the even heightened proactivity about how to manage a mass default situation that seems to be unfolding, and sort of that the government will intervene and try to gently land the defaults. But we'll see what happens. I mean, but I think it's certainly an example of a highly financialized built environment with particularities of certain rules and regulations that connect into ideas of democracy and freedom and kind of nationalism and all of that jazz. Does that kind of answer your question, Jack?
Yeah, very much. It'll be exciting to see how the Chinese manage the situation.
Yeah, no, that's gonna be super interesting.
Great. So there's also some small debate about the 20s, as always, last century. We have a question. Charles Cawthorne, did 1929 start in the property sector? Jack responded, it did. And then we have another comment from Jeffrey Ginsberg stating that I think it started with agriculture in Europe or mismanaged monetary policy by the Federal Reserve System. I don't know, Jack, do you want to?
Yeah, no, Jeffrey's right. Jeffrey's right in as much as at least my understanding of it, I'm not an expert in the 29 crash, certainly I wouldn't claim that, but my understanding of it was that there was a boom in a number of housing markets in the early and mid 1920s in America, and that the collapse of those housing bubbles set up the conditions which then trickled into the stock market the year after. So in 27, 28 basically is when that really collapsed, at least my understanding of it is, and that was quite an important trigger in much the same way that ultimately you could say that the financial crash of 2008 was a liquidity crisis based on credit crunch, which was my favorite type of ice cream you could order in London at the time, only in restaurants that served bankrupt ex-bankers. But of course, it wasn't really caused by the credit crunch or the interbank lending crisis. It was caused by the subprime mortgage crisis. So in the same way that my understanding of the 29 crash is that it was very much effectively a collapse of the stock market, but which was triggered by a crisis just the year before or 18 months before that in the property sector. Anyway, that's my claim. My claim is that all crises of the last 150 years have begun in the housing market or in the property sector. And please just send me an email, tell me that I'm wrong. Let's get to the bottom of it.
Yes, big question. Okay, so we have, and I don't know, I would like to maybe invite if there are any other questions and somebody would like to ask maybe in person instead of writing. If they feel like it, please raise your hand. Will let us know in any way. Yes, no. Okay. Meanwhile, Oh, Nader, yes, please.
Sorry, is my
Yes,
voice coming
yes.
through?
Yeah, please. Yes, your voice is coming through now. Thank you.
If I could only describe the circumstances under which I've been listening to this exquisite presentation in LaGuardia, standing in
Oh,
lines
no.
and with canceling flights. But I just wanted to say a thank you to Matthew and the respondents. I have been trying for a long time to get an intelligent conversation about the intersectionality of architecture, capital, real estate, in precisely the sexy terms we've listened to tonight. And I have yet to hear a conversation of this depth. And I thank you so much, all of you, for opening up this dialogue and in turn, allowing us to understand the relationship between form, spatiality, materiality, and the way it operates, essentially looking under the hood. So, and Matthew, I haven't seen you in many, many years, but clearly the research is wide and deep at the same time. So I just wanted to say a deep thanks from the bottom of my heart for making this occasion possible. And I hope that we can get all of you to come back and expand this conversation. I don't want to end it, but I also, under the circumstances of my flight and all of that, wanted to get this word of thanks across.
Nader, thank you very much, and we wish you a safe flight. It is really stormy here in New York City, so it's truly a thunderstorm.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nader. That was really kind, and I hope to see you in person sometime in a not too distant future. Thanks so much for making this. Thanks so much for making the conversation possible.
Yes, and maybe one more question and then we'll finish up. I think it's time, unfortunately. So Charles Corthorn is asking, can Matthew please elaborate on the effect of capitalism on other professions beyond architecture? So this is going to be another lecture.
Yeah, thank you, Charles, for that question. I feel, I'm trained as an architect, and I'm a licensed and registered architect who teaches in architecture. So my work's really focused on architecture and buildings designed by architects. So, it's a really good question, but I don't feel it's something that I can elaborate on with too much sophistication beyond, we all inhabit a world in which the dominant ideology is a capitalist ideology, and I would underscore that with a finance capitalist ideology. There's lots of great writers who discuss how it's not only that architecture and architects who've been financialized, all of us have been financialized in ways that affect our profession, we're financialized through our professions or through our work, our labor, but also every aspect of almost everything that we possibly do. From the credit card that we take credit cards for granted. I mean, they're relatively new in human history, and certainly this radical proliferation of them is totally new. And the fact that that the stock markets sort of are positioned in the news media scape almost like weather. I mean, we take these things for granted, right? So we deeply in our bodies. I mean, it's a really interesting conversation how our physical bodies have been financialized, right? I mean, our sleep patterns, our dietary patterns, our, the way in which we measure and monitor ourselves and how that's monetized and traded. So it's a really fascinating question. We should come back and have another discussion where we bring in all different sort of disciplines and talk about that. Thanks, Charles.
For sure. Maybe one more one more question. Nora is actually is interested in this one, and so am I. Noel Hernandez is asking, curious how you might imagine this idea as being integrated into the teaching studio. For example, currently my partner and I are teaching an undergraduate housing studio where we push the idea of subdividing an acre into smaller parcels that could be used for multifamily projects. And actually know of several young startups that are now offering this kind of let's say, type of project as a package, you know, as something that has already performed and everything. So maybe that's the last one. And then can you comment on that?
I'll answer it quickly, but I'd love to hear what the others also say about it. I mean, it's a great question. I personally have been teaching all of my studios in recent years on this subject matter. I find actually the studio culture and working with the students an incredibly fruitful and exciting space in which to tackle these issues. And I think, you know, this kind of conversation about coming at things sideways or from underneath and all is the studio environment is fantastic for that. And I think I actually don't think it's very complicated at all. You know, like I don't think, you know, the interesting thing, I think it's very easy to do this stuff in studio, and maybe part of the problem is a perception that I had for a long time, which is that this stuff is we're told constantly, like the discourse is constant, that it's so complex. Like, right, remember the 2007-2008 crisis? Part of the story was, well, you know, the way in which subprime mortgages were packaged and subdivided and traded was in fact so complex that even the people trading it had no idea about it. Now that might be true, but this sort of discourse and promotion that finance is so complex that even the experts don't understand it is a big disservice to many folks who want to kind of approach it and tackle it. And I think we have to have kind of courage to take it on and be willing to like embrace it. And actually there's many dimensions that are much more simpler than a lot of people are trying to purport. And if the experts, you know, I used to be in a relationship actually with someone who, this was years ago, who, you know, was within the Harvard Business School. And honestly, I was struck. This was an amazing person, very bright, but I was amazed within the belly of the beast of how little answers there were. So I was like, that's kind of liberating, because if we don't have all the answers, they don't have all the answers, that's all good. So I think you can just integrate it into studio. And my experience is students that are interested in it, whoa, they really open your eyes.
I would love to quickly follow on the back of that by saying I'm amazed by the scope of professional knowledge that architects have about the history of architecture, about environmental conditions, material conditions, procurement, construction methodology, structural engineering, MEP, planning, policy, discussions of public and private space, history of all forms of typological innovation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? It's vast, the professional scale of knowledge that an architect has. And yet they draw the curtain on the money. They're just like, let's not talk about it. We don't really know about that. Let's not. And it's just like, take control of it. And I'm not suggesting that all architects should become developers, although frankly, I think that would probably lead to an improvement in the urban realm. Because they're not geniuses, people who work in finance or development. They really aren't. In fact, I've often thought that I might be too intelligent to ever really become rich. Because if you want to get rich under capitalism, you have to be really quite stupid in terms of the way in which you approach the world with very limited metrics. So it's like, yeah, I think that it's so important to start to introduce, just in a very casual way, the design of financial products, the processes of the markets, the way in which architecture is funded, as just another parameter like environmental engineering or, you know, whatever it might be.
I guess I would only add to that what I would call power mapping, which is in addition to the finances, who are the agencies, who are the players who contribute to the completion of a building? Who do you need to know to persuade to get something done in the way that you believe it should be done? so that a studio could really be about delineating all the people, all the workers, all the power players that gather around to make it happen. The whole procurement, whether that's financial procurement or whether that's material procurement or whether that's labor procurement, all of that. One needs to know that you're not magically in control of these things. You're only as good as you are able to get other people who you trust and believe in doing the right thing on board with you. Again, I think we tend to train people to think that they're in charge of the program, that they get to be the developer, they get to choose the program. We don't get to choose the program, and we need to learn how to actually be the ones to persuade the programs to go in the direction that we want.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this incredible and thoughtful conversation. Matthew, thank you for joining us, and congratulations on your book. Again, I would encourage everyone who hasn't done so yet to order it. It's really easy to do on Amazon. And yeah, thank you so much, Peggy and Jack. It was great to see you, to meet you. Thank you, Nora and Mauricio, for organizing this. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And until next time. Great.
Thank you. The
Thank
pleasure
you.
was really mine. Hope to
Thank
see you all very soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jack, Peggy, Anna, Mauricio, Nader, everybody. What an amazing, I love the conversation. Hopefully we can continue it very soon, and in person would be even better.